Perfect. That's brilliant. Okay. Would you mind, shall I just say slide, Roland, when we want
yes.
to?
Whatever you like.
Okay. Yeah. So next slide, please. Okay. So this evening, we're basically going to be covering these topics. And as Michael said, I'll present the bit about the Mary, and Michael can chip in as and when, and then the three of us will finish the presentation off, generally looking ahead really. So to begin with, I suppose it's quite important to put the context of what we're looking at tonight. Yeah, just try and contextualize Shetland and Shetland's maritime heritage. So as I'm sure you all know, Shetland is an archipelago of approximately 100 islands, which have been inhabited for about 6,000 years. And the only way to reach Shetland was by boat. And once here, a boat was essential for traveling around, for fishing, moving livestock, and so on. We have no idea what the boats were like prior to the arrival of the Norse around 850 CE. We do have archaeological evidence for the use of small boats in Shetland from this period, from the 9th century. There were boat fastenings found at Jarlshof, along with drawings on slate of boats. And in 2002, Channel 4's Time team undertook an excavation of an alleged boat burial known locally as the Giant's Grave at Wickervaith in Fetla. This excavation revealed the outline of a small boat, defined by the remains of boat fastenings. The boat used for this burial was a 6-oared boat, Norwegian, a sexaring. This burial was dated to the mid-9th century, which coincides with the Gokstad ship. And I should have said, sorry, Roland, slide please. Yeah, it coincides with the Gokstad ship burial discovered in 1880. This ship burial contained much grey furniture that included a sexaring and also a faring. This sexaring will have been similar to the boats used in Shetland during this period. The photo that you're looking at the moment is of a 4-oared boat found in the Gokstad burial, which is the faring. This type of boat will have been used by Norse families living in Shetland. And this type of boat, you can think of it really as equivalent of the family car today. Slide please, Roland. Oops. Bear with me a minute. So, moving on through time, the import of small boats from Norway was continuous from the 9th century right through until the mid-19th century. Shetland, as I'm sure you know, is fairly treeless, and there was no timber available to use for boat building or for house construction. And so when the Norse arrived, they basically brought timber with them and brought boats with them. The boats they brought were transported in one of two ways. They were either set up, that is complete, their bands or frames removed and stowed, and the boats were stowed one within the other upon the deck of the importing ship, or they were transported in rough cut component parts. The two photos of lines plans drawings illustrate what these types of boats look like that were imported to Shetland. The faring, both these farings are from Western Norway, and these boats would have been pretty much the same boats that were used in Shetland, probably from about the 16th century. That would look very similar. Slides, please, Roland. Whoops. So the map you're looking at the moment illustrates the main area in Norway where the timber trade with Shetland was based. So timber was coming from an area called Bienerfjorden, which is just south of Bergen. And as you can see from the map, in the north, there's a place called Samnanger. And then moving south, there's a district called Us. And then on the opposite side of the field is a place called Fusa. Then south of that, Strandvik. And then south of that, Tysnes. Shetland, mainly during the 17th century, had links with Tysnes. And indeed, the Moët family settled in Tysnes. Andrew Moët married a Norwegian noble, and they formed eventually the Barony Rosendal in the Bergen area. And the Moët family were probably one of the wealthiest families in Western Norway at that time. So it's probably no surprise that during the 17th century, Tysnes was a focus for the timber and boat trade for Shetland. Should say that this boat and timber import trade was part of a large Scottish timber and boat import trade. And Scotland imported an awful lot of timber from Western Norway, and they also imported boats. Interestingly, Shetland ended up importing more boats generally than boats imported to mainland Scotland, but it consequently imported less timber. Export tax had to be paid at the customs house in Bergen from the 18th century, early 18th century. And it's of interest to note that many cargoes that were listed as paying tax in Bergen seem to avoid paying tax in Shetland. Indeed, it's been estimated that for every legitimately exported boat, there was at least one boat that was smuggled. Could I have the slide, please, Roland? So there seems to have been about a 60-year transition period from around 1780 until 1840, when Shetland began to develop its own vernacular boat building tradition. There is some tantalizing documentary evidence to suggest that boat building began earlier, maybe during the 1730s, but this evidence is very limited and not definitive. What seems to have happened is that as Shetland's offshore fishing industry developed and boats started going further offshore, then boat specifications changed. Boats became heightened by the addition of an extra strake. Thwarts in Shetland called tafts were made stronger. Keels became deeper to aid windward sailing ability. And Shetland's 4- and 6-oared boats gradually replaced the Norwegian imports. The original boat trading relationship with Norway changed, probably round about just after 1814, around about 1820 onwards, timber began to be imported from southeastern Norway. This timber was then used in boat construction in Shetland. The shape of the new the Shetlanders. And to compound this, it seems that as the market changed following the ending of the 1807 to 1814 blockade of Norwegian ports by the British Navy, prior to the blockade, taxes on import items of manufactured timber and timber goods in general was very high. Following the ending of the blockade, the prices of Norwegian boat imports doubled in price. Over time, as this market weakened, then the workman timber used on these products became inferior to that of the boats built in Shetland. So by the end of the 1860s, the trade in boats was pretty much over. Okay, slide please, Roland. Oops. Sorry, I'm just struggling here, that's it. So what did Shetland's boats look like? The photograph you can see is of it's a very well-known photograph in Shetland. It's of a 6-arene, which is a deep-sea fishing boat called Industry. And the Industry was a typical large offshore half fishing boat. The industry is 30 feet over the stem with a 20-foot keel and has a beam of 8 feet. The mast on the industry was 26 feet long. And as you can see, the boat was sailed with an asymmetric dipping lug rig. In Shetland, we have a replica of industry called Vela May, and I'm one of the skippers that sail Vela May, usually in the summer. This year, obviously, we've not sailed her at all. The boat performs like a big dinghy, really. She's a delight to sail. Really love sailing that boat, and we've got regular crew, and so we're fairly good these days. The six origns fished approximately sort of 20 to 30 miles offshore. And this area of fishing, the deep sea fishing, was called the Haff. And they used long lines to fish for ling and cod. These boats had a crew of 6. And during periods of exceptional weather, they may have ventured slightly further offshore, but not much. The industry Adam Lawrenson in Scalawa in 1891. The boat was actually built to work as the Fula mail boat that ran between the island of Fula and Walls on the west side of Shetland. However, as the boat was being constructed, the mail contract was retendered and awarded to another group of people. So the industry never worked as a mail boat. When she was completed, she was registered to fish, and she fished for 15 years, after which the boat became redundant. And like most six origns that become redundant, the industry worked as a flip boat. A flip boat is basically a boat used to transport goods, people, cargo between one place and another. It's usually a fairly short distance. And the industry actually worked as a flip boat for 50 years in Waz, and we'll see another photograph of her in a minute. Can I have the next slide, please, Roland? So, as well, if you think of Shetland's boats as being divided into 4-oared boats and 6-oared boats, so the industry and six origns are basically 6-oared boats. Another class of boat called the haddock boat, which you can think of as a smaller version of a 6 orign. And again, that's a 6-oared boat. The nomenclature, like Western Norway, uses a number of oars the boat uses to describe the boat. So a 6 orign is in Norway, a sexorring just means 6-oared boat. These subgenres of fishing boats don't use that. They don't have that naming convention. So the boat, the drawing you're looking at the moment, the line span drawings, is of a type of boat called a haddock boat. Again, this is a specialist fishing boat, and it's basically a smaller version of a 6 orign. The drawings you're looking at the moment are of a boat called Brothers. Its fishing number is LK96, which is built by Hay & Company in Lerwick for 3 Walser Brothers in 1880. Walser, if you don't know, is an island on the east coast of Shetland, just off the east coast of Shetland. As the name suggests, this boat was used for haddock fishing, and these fish were caught by longline. The haddock fishery operated within 10 miles of shore and was classed as an inshore fishery. These boats, like other Shetland boat types, were rigged for sailing. Sail was used as much as possible. The usual sailing rig was as asymmetric dipping lug. The important thing to consider is that the boats were launched and recovered from beaches, and the boats were stowed ashore when they weren't being used, which meant they were never bigger than required. And this is why haddock boats, cod boats, and 6 origns, once retired from commercial fishing, ended up being used as flip boats. They basically couldn't really be used for anything else. Once their use as flip boats was complete, many were used as the roof of sheds, colloquially called boatie houses. Have the next slide, please, Roland. Another six-oared boat type was the yawl, and the yawl. There are two types, well, three types of yawl actually. There's the feral yawl and the Dun Rosnes yawl, abbreviated to the Ness yawl, and then there was this other type of yawl, which is called a small yawl in Shetland, a Piri yawl, or a halve yawl. This boat type seems to be the closest relative to the Norwegian faring. This boat you're looking at is actually a six-oared halve yawl, but there are also some four-oared halve yawls. We've just discovered recently a couple of these down in Dun Rosnes. This that you're looking at is a four-oared. It's actually a six-oared yawl, not a four-oared yawl, which was built around about 1890 by a well-known yawl builder called George Jensen from an area called Puns at East Shore in Dun Rosnes. This boat was very handy for fishing, but also for using as a family boat, a bit like the foreen was used in the rest of Shetland. Okay, can I have the next slide, please, Roland? So as I mentioned, the photograph you're looking at now, the Ness yawl Kate, is a typical Shetland yawl. They're about 23 feet over the stems with a keel length of 15 feet. And they're long and narrow, as you probably saw in the previous drawings, much less beam than a normal section ring. These boats were traditionally used for handline fishing for saithe that feed in the strong tidal streams that can be found around the south end of Shetland, but also around the north end of Shetland, around Unst, around Flugger. These strong tides are prevalent around these areas, and this is where saithe, which these boats fish for, feed. And so the idea would be that you would set your lines with stream, and you would keep the yawl just outside the tidal stream. So a huge amount of skill needed to fish using this method. And there'd be one or two people, depending on the sea conditions, doing a thing called and-doing, which basically is keeping the boat on station by using the oars, either rowing slightly forwards or rowing slightly backwards to keep the boat where you need it to be. Okay, next slide, please, Roland.
Yeah, sorry.
You okay? Whoops, I think you've gone too far.
Yeah, I think we're just one slide ahead. That's right.
Thank you.
So just like to bring your attention to the boat in the, that's the industry when she was being used as a flip boat. And the industry was used in a area called Wars, locally pronounced Waz. And you can see within the flip boat, the community of Waz. This boat was traditionally used to flip peats. So people around about May, June would go and cast their peats. And they cast their peats just away from Wars in a voe called Gruting Voe. And there's another voe called Olners Voe. And so the community would go en masse to cast their peats, and then they would stack them and dry them over the summer. And then during the summer, around about August time, they'd all go and collect the peats and bring them back to Waz, where they'd be divided amongst the community. And so the whole community took part in bringing the peats back from Gruting Voe to Waz, and this would take several days. And the people of that community, I mean, that happened up until, I think, just after the Second World War. And it was like a holiday for people, really. People always look forward to flitting the peats back to Oise. And I think the photograph in the bottom left-hand corner just really demonstrates that community spirit of the whole community coming together to bring their peats home in the flitty, as they called the industry locally. The top left-hand picture you can see is a foreen being rowed with a cow being swum alongside, and basically they're swimming the cattle off from a place called Stenness, which is quite a famous fishing station in the 19th century, to the summer grazing to the small islands just offshore. And this happened all round Shetland. So cattle and sheep, and I think not in recent history, but certainly in the past, pigs were also grazed offshore. So they'll be transported from the mainland to the islands for the summer grazing and then brought back again for the winter. And the photograph in the middle is at a place called Sandnes. Actually, there's no, is there a title there? Can't see actually. No, there isn't. And that's the mail boat that went from Papastur, which is an island off the west coast of Oise, to Sandnes with the mail. And that's them launching the boat. So boats were used, you know, to live in Shetland. Roads weren't begun to be constructed in Shetland until around about 1840. And prior to that, you needed a boat. And even post 1840, even up to just after the Second World War, boats were still being used on a regular daily basis. Where I live in Borough, people went to church by boat, people went shopping by boat. When the school on Borough closed at Bridgend, the children went to Scalloway to school, and they went to school by boat. The bridges that link Borough and Trondra to the mainland weren't built until the early 1970s. And the bridges have transformed the way people live now on those two islands. But before that, everything was done by boat. And that's pretty much the same along all the coast of Shetland. And there's great similarity between Shetland and Western Norway, because Western Norway, as you saw from the map of Bjørnafjorden, the west coast of Norway, is a mass of fjords, really. And so to get around Western Norway, you had to go by boat. So the connection between way of life in Western Norway and the way of life in Shetland was very similar. Okay, next slide, please, Roland. I think that's when I hand over to Esther.
Yes, thanks, Mark. And the connection with flit boats, funnily enough, syncs quite nicely with my own story that I mentioned. We'd sort of come up to Shetland slightly randomly, but my mother actually used to come up to Shetland for our holidays in the 1950s and has great stories of she travelled on the Earl of Zetland, as was the steamer then, which has actually just been broken up in North Shields. I saw the other day I didn't realise the Earl of Zetland still existed, but it's just about to get broken up now. And she has stories of all the flit boats coming out to meet the Earl of Zetland as it came into the various voes as they were travelling up. That was when the Earl of Zetland used to come into, not into Lerwick, but it came into Hills up to Balta Sound. So she can remember all the herring stations and that kind of life when the flit boats, this was in the early 50s, so the flit boats were still just about a thing. And that was sort of the original connection between me and Shetland is being brought up with these stories. She'd come up because her father was, he was a scientist with the SOE, and he flew in and out of Shetland during the war, my grandfather, and he was a electrical engineer who then went into chemical engineering, and he was interested in battery technology. So he was flown into wherever there was torpedoed U-boats or crashed planes or anything for that. So the flit boats actually kind of feature into my childhood stories of her remembering seeing them with ponies aboard and cattle aboard and everything, coming in and out in the early 50s. So what I'm going to be talking about this evening is we're now going to switch from sort of Mark's picture of a fairly vibrant 19th and 20th century community using these boats to what we've got left of them archaeologically now. I'm going to talk about the archaeology of the small boat in terms of structures and the coastal archaeology, and then we'll go on to talk about the archaeological work that was done on the surviving boat itself, the Mary. So to go back to put Shetland in a sort of general perspective, Shetland has had rising sea levels ever since the last ice age, and has a lot of drowned landscapes like the one you're looking at there between sort of Whiteness and Weasdale there. But obviously, like everywhere else, it's being challenged with increasingly rapid sea level rise and increasingly regular extreme storm events. So the coastal archaeology is being threatened at a speed than it never was before. There is very little data for Shetland in terms of sea level rise, but the extreme storm events are sort of, to put it into perspective, the kind of storm that you would get once every 10 years is now happening every year. And the kind of storm you would get once in a lifetime is now happening every 10 years. There's sort of the kind of anecdotal evidence for it. But there's been very little research done. However, like much of the UK and especially the Scottish coastline, the archaeology is eroding, and with Shetland, with the limited good land, it meant most of the settlement is around the coast. So we're seeing an awful lot of eroding archaeology coming up across the Isles. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. A lot of this is totally multi-period archaeology. There's a couple of examples involved with it, Mail and Chanarwick, which are both prehistoric sites. We're not sure of the dating of the site at Mail, but the name would suggest a Pictish connection. The pottery you can see in this picture is probably Bronze Age, certainly probably prehistoric anyway, and was just eroding out onto the beach there after a storm. This is quite common around Shetland. The picture to the right is Chanarwick, and this is actually the coast edge after we'd cleaned it up, ready to record it. But this is actually what turned out to be the floor levels in a wheelhouse and hearth deposits in a wheelhouse that was inserted into a brock that we didn't actually realise existed until we started working on this coast edge with the guys from Scape, who I'm sure you'll have encountered plenty of times as well down there. So there's been plenty of sort of prehistoric recording, and there's been some excavations, and we've been doing work with Archaeology Shetland, sort of monitoring this eroding archaeology. But when Marc approached me in a couple of years ago, it really piqued my interest, because I'd been doing some work on actually Second World War archaeology, and I have a bit of a tendency to go after unloved archaeology. So we were trying to persuade people to like lumps of concrete. And then Marc came up and was interested in boat naust. And if I could have the next slide, please. Now, the boat nausts are everywhere in Shetland. Almost every beach has at least one boat naust, or had, even if it doesn't have. It varies slightly on the makeup of the beach. Some allowed boats to be pulled up onto the shingle and didn't need a naust. And these are so normal in the landscape that people barely see them. And archaeologically, some of them have been recorded, but there certainly hasn't been extensive recording done. So that immediately attracted my interest, because these are obviously at the head of the beach and eroding very rapidly. A boat naust is effectively, the word naust comes from the Norse, Old Norse naust, and in some areas of Shetland they're still called nausts. It depends on the dialect for the particular islands. And these were effectively a sort of boat shelter. In Western Norway, they are still a boat shed. When they've translated across to Scotland, they appear to have become a kind of largely unroofed boat sort of shelter at the head of the beach. So they can either be a walling, like you can see on one side, or sort of a scoop out of the beach, like you can see on the other picture. And so they can be very ephemeral, can disappear incredibly easily. And also a lot of people, they're very much within living memory. I mean, you can see one here with a boat rotting in situ, which isn't uncommon. And some of these boats have been used recently enough that they're still tied up with nylon rope. So these are boats that have been used easily within living memory, and then have maybe been abandoned when somebody's died, or they've been replaced, and people have moved on. So this is very much a sort of overlooked area of archaeology. Of course, what also goes beside it is things like piers and net shed. There's a lot of associated archaeology, but we were particularly interested initially with the Noosts. And could I have the next slide, please? I've got a few images coming up of actually Stenness fishing station, which keys in with what Mark was talking about earlier. A lot of this archaeology is just very, Stenness is obviously well recorded. It's the remains of a fishing station and quite a well-known one. But it's still, even though it's quite away from the sea, in the sense of, as you can see from one direction on this photo, it's still very much an at-risk site. So there's big sites like the fishing stations. And if you could have the next slide, please. Oh,
Have I gone too far?
Jumped one. Oh, I seem to have a slide that you don't have. That's fine. It's not a problem. It was only another slide of Stenness. So we've got the fishing stations, and then we've also got the small sort of vernacular sites. Sorry, jump forward to Shoreside. It's fine. Jump forward to the next slide. And this is a croft that I'm going to talk a little bit about to put into perspective the kind of stories that go with these Noosts. This is a croft we were invited to look at last summer. It's an idyllic situation, as you can see, down by the coast at Bridge of Walls, or Brig of Wars, as it would be called locally. And this is a typical well-preserved croft. The owners, the Amenity Trust approached us because the owners were wanting to knock down a boat noose that they had, an upstanding stone boat noose that I'll show photos of in a moment, and to actually replace it very topically with a boat shed that would be more suitable for for their needs. So that was kind of a classic combination of a classic example of sort of moving on and modernizing. But this didn't have it wasn't scheduled or protected in any way, so there was no planning constraints. But the Amenity Trust wondered if we would be interested in recording it before it went, which of course we were. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. Brilliant. This is the noose that we had at Shoreside, which is actually, as you can see, quite a different form of noose to the ones we saw earlier. This is purely upstanding walling, not actually anything into the coast edge, but functioned in exactly the same way. It allowed a boat to be pulled up to the head of the beach and protected from the weather, especially during the winter, and you could work on it and you didn't have to worry about the wind or storm surges taking your boat. So we worked this summer for a couple of days recording the archaeology here, and then Mark did a lot of legwork in the archives. We spoke to the owners, and we actually turned up this noose connected to an awful lot of history, unexpected history, to be honest. Can we have next slide, please? For a start, the site was actually unexpectedly well preserved. As you can see, the croft is virtually unchanged from 1920 to 2019, and literally it's just a swap for forine to a car in a very classic update there. So we knew we were dealing with a good example of the kind of vernacular use of these small boats. And can we have the next slide, please? Then when Mark went further into the archives, we discovered there was actually a lot of information about the family, and including photographs. So we've got see a photograph in the 50s of Shoreside, still looking very, very traditional, with the stacks of hay in the backyard there. And one of the Henry family who lived in it, baiting his haddock lines, ready to go out in the boat. Can we have the next slide, please? What we didn't expect to find, we had a classic sort of story that the house was built with ship's timbers, and as anyone who's dealt with old houses will know, that is absolutely one of those classic stories that on Shetland is more likely to be true. Elsewhere might be hearsay and sort of romantic imagining. But the owners, when they invited us in, said that they had this ship's nameplate, which was in the loft, which was supposed to belong to the ship that the house was built from. And so we did some research there and discovered that indeed this completely agreed, the story completely agreed with the tradition of the way the house had been built. And this boat was laden with coal going from Edinburgh to Bremerhaven, shipped to heavy sea and ended up in Shetland, in a huge way, of course, in Grooting Voe, which is a small voe by this house. She was grounded and freed. We had a look in the newspapers, and it was suggested in the local paper that she was to be repaired and then was to be sold. But obviously at some point they've given up on that, broken her up, and used the timber to construct Shoreside. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, and so, sorry, can we skip back one again? It's all right, we haven't missed one. I've just gone ahead of myself. So the results from going to analyse that naust, it meant we could then produce a report. What we expected to be was just recording a naust before it was demolished, and being a dry stone naust, it literally would have taken a few hits with a JCB and then it would have been gone. But we discovered we actually, with the work we'd done, we could actually date the house construction from between 1863, which is when the Seeker, the boat, was wrecked, and 1877, when the house appeared on the first Ordnance Survey map. The naust is typical of a naust of that sort of period in the West Mainland of Shetland, and we were able to trace the family and the family history of the family that owned Shoreside, and able to give the new owners, or relatively new owners, a full history of their house, effectively, that all grew out, or including boat names and owners' names, that all grew out of just a short naust survey. And this is the kind of level of connectivity that we're finding the nausts are tying us back to. The stories, because they were used so recently, the stories are still extant and existent if we can just find them. And if anyone wants to look at more information on Shoreside, the report is actually up on the Modadi website, so it's open access that you can have a look at. Could I have the next slide, please? So when we first set up Modadi, we knew that there was this level of information potentially available connected to nausts, not always as extant as we're getting at Shoreside, but certainly we knew there was a lot of information, but it was disappearing very rapidly. Both the archaeology disappearing to the sea and just people's memories going to time. We were losing some of the older folk who remembered, and memories were starting to get muddled and confused as they were sort of handed down the generations. So we were very keen to get some recording going as quickly as we could. When COVID hit in March, we were actually on the final stage of an HLF bid for funding for the Borough Naust project, which was to capture this focused as a sort of pilot project on an island, the island where Marc lives, of Borough, because it's a self-contained island, certainly historically. Now it's got bridges, but it was a self-contained island, and so it was a logical pilot project to have a look at recording information on these nausts and tying them back to archive evidence and oral history. There's when we started this, there were in the public domain, there's approximately nausts recorded on Shetland. Now, we knew that this would increase hugely once we started to look into it. Unfortunately, as with many projects this year, the Burren Noost project wasn't to be at the moment. It's been shelved temporarily, partly because of funding and partly because it was a very engaged community project, which was going to be working with the local history group. It was going to be working with the local Moving On project, which is people coming back into employment, and working with adults with learning difficulties as well. Obviously, they're all particularly vulnerable groups, and so that's been shelved until we see where things are at. But the time and the sea doesn't wait for anybody. So we decided to launch a project during lockdown, which we called Caain da Noosts project. Now, when you carry in something in Shetland dialect, you're gathering it. So you're like car sheep. So it's a Caain is gathering. So if you were carrying sheep in the hill, you'll be gathering all the sheep off the moors and bringing them down. So we called this Caain da Noosts, which was sort of like a gathering of the Noosts. And we put a call out to the Shetland community and said, we don't want you to break any guidance. We don't want you to break lockdown. You don't even need to leave your house. All we want is your photographs of Noosts, or walk to your local beach if it's within restrictions at that point. We want a grid reference if you can give us one, or a clear location. And we would like any memories or information or stories that you've got that are connected with these Noosts and their boats. And the response was really very, very heartening and very surprising, to be honest. These are just some photographs that people sent in, some lovely photos, and a load of detail we got in so many stories. Next slide, please. During lockdown, we were able, without Mark and I never met, we basically didn't leave our houses, and we recorded over 100 Noosts in stories and photos all during lockdown with nobody actually breaking any guidance. This is our Noost map, which is available on our website. Again, it's interactive, so you can zoom in. This is just to give an example of quite how many Noosts there are. We've already, just by putting out a call to the public without leaving the house, already doubled the number of Noosts recorded in Shetland. We've now got a sample right across the Isles of we can see from the photos, we've got condition, we can see which are the most threatened, and we've got a good sample across the Isles of different types. Like I was saying about the West Mainland having more different styles and areas. The other thing that we've picked up during this is some interesting photographs of roofed Noosts. So it'll be very hard to find archaeological evidence, but it'll be interesting to see if there's more oral testimony and more photographs out there of potentially roofed Noosts. So whether they were more like the Norwegian examples still more recently, and have just decayed out of living memory. So this is where we're at the moment. We're just wrapping up this project. It's given us a snapshot of the state of the Noosts across Shetland and an idea about a sample of how many more there are out there that haven't been fully recorded. We are hoping to get out. We've already gone out to have a look at a few as things relaxed. We're hoping to get out to some more, and we'll talk later on in this session tonight further going forward. So I'm going to hand back to Mark now to talk about Shetland's oldest surviving boat, the Mary.
Thank you, Esther. May I have the next slide, please, Roland? Thank you. So, as you can see from the photo on the left-hand side, the Mary is currently exhibited as a boatie house. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. And the photo on the right, you can see Michael there in the foreground, recording the measurements being taken from the Mary. by Ian Tate on the stepladder, who's the curator of the museum, and an assistant whom I don't know, with the ruler. The Mary is a really interesting boat, mainly because she's so old. I mean, she predates 1869, which is when the first customs fishing boat register came into being. The boat, the Mary, was built by Hay and Company under the supervision of the firm's foreman, boat builder, a chap called Davy Leask. Excuse me. And she fished from the east coast island of Walser, which was a major centre. The half fishery at that time, by the sort of latter part of the 19th century, was not destined to last particularly long, and began to decline rapidly during the 1880s. This is partly due to the herring industry, which at that time was growing and was becoming more profitable than the half fishery. And also in 1881, there was a gale, and 58 men lost at sea. The Mary was actually in that gale and survived. And then later in 1884, the Mary was involved in the rescue of the crew from the wrecked Danish bark called the Olba, which had struck some rocks off Sandwich near Simbister, called the Fleshens. The skipper of the Mary was awarded a medal by the Danish king. But sadly, Willie Anderson, who was the skipper, died in 1885. And the other owners, who were the Mary's crew, they were John Anderson Jr., Willie Bruce, and John Stewart, decided the half fishery was no longer economic and the boat's fishing registration was cancelled. And quite often in the fishing boat register, when a boat's registration is cancelled, you'll see the reason being given as boat useless, or boat useless basically, which is a bit of an anathema really, because although the boat wasn't really in a condition to fish at the half anymore, the boat was still very seaworthy. So the boat's registration was cancelled in 1886, but the Mary continued to be used. And in 1891, Robert Stuart Bruce from Simbister recorded a trip aboard the boat in December of that year, where he went from Sandwich in Walser to Lerwick in the Mary. And he said, "We had a single reef and a following wind, and I think we got to Hayes Dock in an hour and 30 or 40 minutes. The Mary was thought to be a fine boat on the wind, but not a good runner. But she ran well enough for me. It was more like flying when we lifted on the sea, and she scudded on the back of the rollers. I enjoyed that run, I can tell you." At some point after 1891, the decision not to put the Mary to sea again was made. The boat was hauled a short distance inland and sawn in two. The two halves formed the roofs of two boaty sheds. Unfortunately, the stern section was destroyed during the 1960s. However, happily, the forward half survived until 1993. Went to the museum. The Mary was really saved by the Shetland Museum and Archives curator, Dr. Ian Tate, who instigated a major programme of conservation in 2011. And as you can see, the Mary is now a prominent display feature. However, the Mary is used as a connecting piece between two halls in the museum. And so visitors walk through what would have been the boaty house, and very seldom do they look up to see what's above them, which is Shetland's oldest boat. Could I have the next slide, please, Roland? Stratigos comes in. as Michael was saying, he was in Shetland in 2016 with his wife, Claire. And that was during Boat Week, I think, Michael, wasn't it? And you got talking to Ian, and you wanted to undertake a project, and Ian suggested documenting the Mary. And this documentation process was fascinating. I went along for one evening. I wasn't really involved very much in the actual documenting of the boat. This is all Michael's work. And if we go to the next slide, please. You can see the amount of detail that Michael's gone to in recording the Mary. She had some patch repairs and some splits. And I think if we go to the next slide, if that's okay, please, Roland. And Michael also recorded the boat photogrammetrically, which is really helpful because you can rotate these 3D models and get a really good idea of what the boat is like today. As you can see from these photographs, it's only the forward section of the boat that survives. And I don't know if you can see, but on the framing, what in Shetland we call the bands, the framing is held in place by wooden trenils. And there's a variety of fastenings. Some are the original, what we thought were iron fastenings. In fact, if we could go to the next slide, please, Roland. If you look at the left-hand picture, you can see, I don't know if you can see, but there's some imprints, diamond rove imprints, and you can see the original holes, nail holes that have been plugged with wooden pegs. And that's when the strake was replaced. On the right-hand side, you can see what the fastenings were like. They were strips of iron that had lines struck across them diagonally. So you end up with these rhomboid or diamond-shaped roves. And they came in strips with the holes pre-drilled or bored through. And the boat builder or shipwright could then just snap a rove off one of the strips when they wanted to use to fasten it, rivet the boards together. Now, we hadn't realised, it was actually Ian Tate that observed it, but if you see the board nearest the bottom of the picture on the left-hand side, you can see some what looks like white staining around the fastenings. And this is the remains of galvanizing. I think if you go to the next slide, please, Roland. We hadn't realized that galvanized fastenings were being used from quite an early period in Shetland. And these newspaper articles were actually found by a friend of mine, Dr. Adrian Osler, who did the first research back in the 1970s about Shetland boats. And I was chatting with Adrian. He said, "Oh, I've been looking at for galvanized chain. That's why he's got circles around the word galvanized. And on that other article, it's round chain. I don't think you can see it on here." So the Mary was originally fastened with galvanized fastenings, which was a good find for us. We hadn't realized that those fastenings were being used in Shetland at that time. Okay, so if you could go to the next slide, please, Roland. Other things of interest on the Mary was moulded beads called snick. And this is a West Norwegian tradition that was passed down into Shetland tradition. The bottom right-hand picture is of an Utsava, which was being built in 2015 by a boat builder at the Utsava Verkstaden called Stig Henneman. And you can see quite clearly the moulded bead on the bottom outside strake. The picture above that is of a foreen from the 1880s, which is pretty much intact. There's been very little done to that boat. All the fastenings on the boat are original. And every strake has a snick that you can see. This snick pattern dates back to around about 1100 CE. And prior to that, which we didn't look at on the Gokstad Faring, the Gokstad Faring and Sexring has a snick pattern which predates this. So the snick's been used for a long time. And it was originally thought that the snick was decorative. However, I've heard in Western Norway that some of the boat builders there, a friend of mine, Helge, talked about the Norwegian fishermen preferred a boat to be flexible. And the way they would test the flexibility of a boat would be to shake the horn of the stem. And if they shook the bow of the stem at the bow of the boat, they'd expect to see the horn of the after stem also moving. And that's how flexible they wanted their boats. And Helge was saying that by putting the snick on the boards, on the inside and the outside of the boards, when they were fastened, this just helped the boards flex a bit more. And he said the fishermen would prefer to have a slightly leaky boat than a stiff boat to fish from. We have some tools from the 19th century, and this moulding tool in Shetland is called a strekhovel or snickhovel. Hovel in Norwegian just means plane, basically. So it's a straight plane or a snick plane. And this snick plane belonged to a very well-known Shetland boat builder called Jack Schoen. Okay, next slide, please, Roland. I think that might be it, actually. I think that's it.
That's all I've got.
I think that brings us on to the summation, Mark. And I just wanted to add that the overall sort of aim of what Motor Dye is doing here is extracting these details that are very much at risk. And they are at risk from rising sea levels, from development, from passing of time. And it is so critical what Motor Dye is trying to do to gather in that information before it's lost irrevocably. And that's really the sort of urgency that Motor Dye is responding to. And it's very exciting to see it happen because it's desperately needed. And I think that's really illustrated by the fact that there's only 100 or so naust recorded around Shetland, and just through sitting on couches and looking at Google Maps and engaging local people, and I think we could probably double that again without barely trying, really. And so it's going to be up to Marc and Esther, who are up there on the ground to lead that effort, and I'm really excited to see what happens as they do that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. As Esther was saying, this year's been a bit of a struggle for us in Motor Dye. Should say that we're a community interest company, which and everything we do is not for profit, and we don't generate very much money. In fact, Esther and I just give our time free of charge, as does Michael. So we just hope that things might be able to ease up a bit next year, and we're just trying to restructure ourselves slightly and alter our focus to take into account the situation we all find ourselves in currently this year. I don't know, Esther, if you'd like to add anything at all.
Not particularly. I think it's just, we're sort of refocusing a little bit, but keeping the same outlined. It's just finding the best ways of doing it. It's like we had to adapt to sort of lockdown conditions, of what we could do. It's like many organizations at the moment, we're just feeling our way through the dark at the minute in how we can best do this. as conditions change. But as Michael says, it's the urgency of it, which is why instead of shelving the whole lot during lockdown, we decided to carry on trying to push ahead. And now is kind of a snapshot across Shetland. And as Michael said, I'm sure we can easily add the same again, if not double it again, you know, with the amount of new sites. And that's without even adding piers and net sheds and all the rest of the associated archaeology that's there. And so we're just moving forward. I mean, the community's been brilliant. The community have stayed engaged, even when we couldn't actually be out there doing anything physically. They've stayed engaged with us online, carried on contributing their time and interest. And this, so at the moment, we're just sort of feeling our way forward with how we can carry on doing that.
Yes.
So I'll come in here now and suggest that we just open the conversation out to involve us. I'm just going to